Yeah, right, I know. Okay, I'm going to call the meeting to order. It's actually 4:02. We're a little late because we were in another session. It is June 6, 2016. May I have roll call?
Mayor Crawford.
Here.
Commissioner Ryan.
Here.
Commissioner Blanchard.
Here.
Commissioner Davis.
Here.
Commissioner Hardy.
Here.
Will all those who can stand, please stand, and we'll say the Pledge of Allegiance and moment of silence. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Awards and proclamations. We do have a proclamation.
The month of June 2016 as LGBT Pride Month in the City of Salina, Clinton Walker, North Central Chapter of Equality Kansas Chair will read the proclamation.
In recognition of June 2016 as LGBT Pride Month, whereas June is lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender LGBT Pride Month across the United States, and whereas even though the struggle for LGBT equality is making progress throughout much of this nation and the world, it is still a fact that in the state of Kansas, the city of Salina, and even in our own city government, LGBT individuals can still be fired from their jobs, denied housing, and refused public accommodation just for being LGBT. And whereas LGBT youth are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than their straight peers, and more than 1/3 of all LGBT youths have attempted suicide, and 9 out of 10 LGBT youths report harassment at school, and 3/5 report feeling unsafe at school. And whereas being out and visible is the most important action members of the LGBT community can engage in to provide positive role models and support to both young and older individuals who may be struggling with their sexual orientation or gender identity. And whereas LGBT citizens contribute to the fabric and expression of diversity within our community, LGBT community members work alongside other Salina citizens in places of employment and contribute to the success of employers and businesses and donate their time, talent, and labor to community organizations. And whereas the LGBT community in Salina has organized to fight discrimination and support fairness and has taken an active role in bettering this community for all individuals, including the LGBT population. And whereas from generation to generation, ordinary Americans have led a proud march toward freedom, fairness, and full equality under the law, not just for some, but for all. Now therefore, I, Kay Crawford, Mayor of the City of Salina, do hereby proclaim the month of June 2016 as LGBT Pride Month in the City of Salina, and I urge every citizen of Salina to join me in celebrating the diversity and character of our community and highlight the importance of the LGBT citizens in our community and making this city a safer and more welcoming community for everyone.
Thank you, Clinton.
Welcome.
What activities are you planning to have?
We've got 2 events on Saturday, June 25th. We have a picnic/potluck from 1 to 4 p.m. in Oakdale Park. Hot dogs and beverages are provided. Please bring a side dish if you're able to. Fun for all ages. There will be a band playing. And then later that day in the evening is a Stonewall Pride dance from 9 p.m. to 2 a.m. at the Muse Ballroom. You must be 18 to enter. Tickets $5 in advance or $7 at the door, available at Astra Books or at the picnic.
Okay.
Okay?
Thank you very much.
Sure,
And here
you're
is your
welcome.
proclamation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Mayor Crawford to recognize outgoing fire engineer EMT John Wisniewski.
John. Where is John? There he is. Come forward. I have a few things to say about you. John started his career with the Salina Fire Department on February 16th, 1988. Does it seem that long ago?
Yes, it does.
John spent the next several years as a firefighter EMT until gaining his paramedic certification. John spent the next 12 years as one of the department's outstanding medics. In June of 2004, John was promoted to fire engineer MICT and continued his position until his retirement. Throughout his career, John's ability to teach, mentor, and lead younger firefighters was forefront and will be greatly missed. The Salina Fire Department and City Commission thank John for his 28 years of dedication and service to the citizens of Salina. And I expect that probably as an EMT, you've probably been in my home. But I thank you very much, and the commission thanks you. Would you like to say a few words?
Not really.
You don't have to. We know that you, and we hope that you have a very good retirement, and when the sirens go off, you know you don't have to jump out of bed and run out of the house, get on a truck, or whatever. We appreciate you very much, and thank you so much, and have a good retirement.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mayor Crawford to recognize outgoing Finance Director Rod Franz.
I thought maybe Rod disappeared. I have a few things to say about you, too.
I bet you do.
Rod has been with the city as our Director of Finance since early 1996. He came to Salina from Arkansas City, where he served in the same role. Prior to that, Rod served in various other capacities for Kansas communities and also as a city manager for a time in an Oklahoma community. Rod carries with him a BS degree from Emporia State University and an MPA from Wichita State University. He has always been very active in both work-related and community nonprofit organizations. Rod's role as finance director is very simple: collect the city's revenues efficiently, account for them with integrity, and disperse them by directives of the city commission and city manager. And I must say, he probably knows more how to direct those than the city commission. Maybe not the city manager, but the city commission. During his 20 years in Salina, Rod has performed all of these duties quite well. Those who know Rod would also say that from time to time he would also throw in a little spirited humor. We will miss that very much. This organization has been well served by Rod's contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And would you like to say something?
It's to quote a Grateful Dead song, it's been a long, strange trip. And, I've worked with lots and lots of good people who, intend the best for their community, and maybe a few not so much. But, overall, it's been a very good experience. So thank you.
I think both of these guys deserve a standing ovation. Both John and Thank you, guys. We have no public hearings. We do have citizens forum. Is there anyone here who would like to speak at the citizens forum? Anything that is not on the agenda? Please come forward if you'd like 5 minutes to speak on whatever you'd like to speak about. Okay. We'll go on to public hearings and items scheduled for a certain time. And there is none, so we'll go on to the consent agenda.
Approve the minutes of May 23rd, 2016. Authorize the purchase and installation of the upgrade of radio consoles for the Emergency Communication Center to KCOM, Inc. in the amount of $40,161. Approve Resolution Number 16-7355, authorizing the city manager to enter into an agreement with Travelers for renewal for the city's comprehensive property casualty insurance in the amount of $411,470. Approve reallocation of 2016 vehicles and equipment in buildings and facilities authorization. And then authorize staff to request a bid for new phone system from Nextech.
Okay, is there anything on the consent agenda that any commissioner would like to pull? If not, I'll entertain a motion to approve.
I move that we approve the consent agenda as presented.
Second.
I have a motion to approve consent agenda and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign. We'll go on to administration.
First reading ordinance number 16-10836, levying a 0.75% general purpose retailer sale tax within the city of Salina, repealing ordinance number 08-10475.
Okay. Where am I here? Sorry.
That's right.
Too much paperwork up here.
I believe that's mine, Mayor, if you'd like me to go
Is
ahead.
that your area?
Yes.
Okay.
You all are certainly familiar with the sales tax election. The county election officer has certified the results of the election. The next step is the ordinance that is before you, whereby, assuming your approval, the city clerk, by statute, is to direct a copy of that ordinance to the Kansas Department of Revenue so that they may begin collecting the sales tax at the new rate. As I'm sure you're aware, the ordinance does two things. One, levies the new sales tax of 0.75% and repeals the current sales tax rate. So this is first reading on that ordinance that levies the tax and informs the Department of Revenue of the adjustment in the rate. Be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Mr. Bankston? Any public comment? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion.
Madam Mayor, move approval on first reading ordinance number 16-10836, levying a 0.75% general purpose retailer sales tax within the city of Salina, repealing ordinance number 08-10475.
Second.
I have a motion and a second for first reading of ordinance number 16-10836, levying a 0.75 general purpose retailer sales tax within the city of Salina and repealing ordinance number 08-10475. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed, same sign. Okay. I'm happy to report that our streets should be in better condition, and our parks and hopefully our river. Going to move on to 7.2.
Approve resolution number 16-7356, fixing a time and place to conduct a public hearing regarding the issuance of industrial revenue bonds to finance the Salina Fieldhouse project.
Okay, Mr. Scragg.
Thank you, Mayor and Commissioners. Have a couple more new market tax credit items for you today. We'll have a couple next week, and there'll be more in the offing. As you may recall from the description of the new market tax credit funding structure, that we need to form two what they call affiliate corps or corporations, one being a leveraged lender, the other being a qualified active low-income community business. And as part of that transaction, the ownership of the field house will reside with the Qualic B. And so as we've worked with our bond counsel and financial advisor and legal counsel on that structure, we identified that with it being owned technically outside of the city's ownership, then it is not entitled to an immediate property tax and sales tax exemption. There's plenty of reason to believe that we could successfully make application for that, but that typical process would be after the project was commenced and under construction and on the tax rolls, you would make that application. Another alternative that was identified in the item that's before you today is to pursue industrial revenue bond financing. It is a project that's eligible for IRB financing, and the nature of industrial revenue bond financing is that it makes the project property tax and sales tax exempt. So it's a long way around the barn to get back to where we intended with the Fieldhouse project in the first place in terms of being property tax and sales tax exempt. And as our bond counsel has put it, it's kind of a belt and suspenders approach. The ability to apply for property tax and sales tax exemption would be the belt, but the IRB financing is a more direct means and would be the suspenders in this scenario. So the item before you today is merely setting the public hearing, which is one of the required elements of industrial revenue bond financing, going ahead and setting that public hearing date for June 20th, at which time we would then take further action on the IRB financing structure. So with that, we've identified options for your consideration. One would be to approve the resolution as proposed. Another would be to postpone consideration of the resolution and provide staff with direction regarding any amendments that you would like or additional information you'd like to receive. The third would be to take no action at this time, which would not fix a time and date and would essentially not make it possible for us to use IRB financing as part of this transaction. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Mr. Scragg, how would this public hearing for IRB, for the use of those types of financing, how would that differ from, say, when, I'll use this latest example I can think of, with CASA did theirs? I mean, the way I understood that is that the bonds were paid off through a transfer of ownership and rental and in essence paid off over rent, basically, and then the ownership transferred back. How does this work in this instant when the ownership of the building will be the Qualic B?
The IRBs would be issued, and it would be the city's debt. It would just be rather than a GO bond issuance, being an IRB bond issuance extends the property tax and sales tax exemption. So I don't know that it's as applicable to CASA as much as rather than a more traditional general obligation bond issuance like we might have contemplated, it would be industrial revenue bonds that would be utilized.
Okay, so the sales tax exempt on building materials and the fixtures and all that, would that be, what would it just be the city portion of the sales tax, or would it be every?
No, it would be a full exemption, similar to if we owned it like we had originally intended.
Okay. All right.
Any other questions? Any public comment? Okay, I'll entertain a motion to,
Madam Mayor, I would move that we approve resolution number 16-7356, fixing a time and place to conduct a public hearing regarding the issuance of industrial revenue bonds to finance the Salina Fieldhouse project.
Second.
I have a motion and a second to approve Resolution 167356, fixing a time and place to conduct a public hearing regarding the issuance of industrial revenue bonds. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
And those opposed, same sign. Motion passes. On to 7.3.
Approve resolution number 16-7357, authorizing approval of new market tax credit term sheets for financing the Salina Fieldhouse project.
Mr. Scragg.
This also relates to the new market tax credit financing and is one of the procedural steps in the process to ultimately get us to closing on the new market tax credit financing. I provided a little bit of a timeline there. Back in August of last year, we engaged SB Friedman as our new market tax credit consultants on a contingent fee basis to attempt on our behalf to find qualify or community development entities that would wish to invest in our project. And on March 4th of this year, we received notification that they had identified primarily Dakota's America, but also J.P. Morgan Chase that were interested in investing in our project. So based on that, then, we engaged both New Market Tax Credit Legal Counsel as well as a New Market Tax Credit accountant, and we used their advice to review the letter of intent that you acted on April 4th. That letter of intent was kind of the initial step of our intention to pursue New Market Tax Credit financing. At that time, we noted that we would need to begin work on a term sheet and finalizing the term sheet specific to our project. And we also noted that we were liable for the legal expenses of both Dakota's America and J.P. Morgan Chase. You may recall that we referred to the term of haircuts. The New Market Tax Credit financing in total is greater than the net proceeds that we might see, but as part of what they refer to as the haircuts or the costs that are paid before the net benefit is realized by the city are those legal expenses that I mentioned. So as part of the letter of intent, we capped the legal expense at $35,000. That was their best estimate of how much legal work would be involved to get to the point that we could bring a term sheet to you. And they have not exceeded that cap. But as we go forward with the remainder of the transaction, I want to be clear that that cap's no longer in effect, and we still will be incurring legal expenses. On the presumption that we reach closing, which we don't have any reason to believe that we wouldn't, all those costs would be reimbursed with New Market Tax Credit proceeds. So upon the execution of the term sheet, staff will continue to meet the obligations that you may have seen identified in the term sheet. There's a long laundry list of deliverables and confirmations that need to be provided. We've been working on those diligently for quite some time now. I discussed in the staff report the worst case scenario, which would be the possibility that we continue to incur legal expenses, but for some reason we don't reach closing on the New Market Tax Credit transaction. At that point, we would have an exposure for the legal expenses that would not be reimbursable with New Market Tax Credit proceeds. All parties involved, Dakota's, Chase, our legal counsel, S.B. Friedman, our New Market Tax Credit consultants, and myself, with what little limited knowledge I have about New Market Tax Credit transactions, don't have any reason to believe that we wouldn't close. It's really a function of completing all the deliverables and the remaining items that you see in the term sheet. So we're optimistic that we would be able to close the third week in July. And at that point, we would need to have our financial transactions in place in terms of bond financing as well as stakeholder proceeds. We would go to the closing with the funds that we've committed to the project, and that's when we'd realize the $2.7 million net benefit from the New Market Tax Credit financing. They're very familiar with the project and the details of the project. There aren't any concerns about the scope or our intended uses of the funds. It's really a function of completing the tasks identified in the term sheet. I failed to mention it in my last report, but in terms of conformance with the strategic plan, the Fieldhouse project seems to comply with a number of those, including making Salina exciting to live in and thriving both economically and socially, and having a quality of life that appeals to residents and visitors, and having a high-quality downtown and high-quality services. And I think it goes without saying, but as you know, the New Market Tax Credit component of that truly is a but-for. Without that, we weren't going to be able to make the budget on the design facility. So I don't want to dwell on it too much, but as part of the fiscal note, I noted that the legal expense exposure could reach $250,000 in a full worst-case scenario. I spoke with our legal counsel and our consultant, and they estimated that we're about 25% of the way through the legal work that needs to be done. Frankly, I was hoping that as much as we'd already seen, it was going to be more than that, but apparently there's quite a bit more work to do. So what's before you this evening is a resolution authorizing the mayor to sign the New Markets Tax Credit term sheet for the financing of the Fieldhouse. Your options would be to approve it, to postpone consideration of it and ask for additional information or revisions, or choose not to approve the resolution, which would effectively decline New Market Tax Credit financing, and we would no longer have the net benefit funding the remaining gap. In this particular instance, when it says the staff recommends option number 1, I would add that includes our hired New Market Tax Credit Counsel as well as Tony Smith with SB Friedman. So with that, I'd be happy to try to answer any questions. If need be, our New Market Tax Credit Counsel is available for a call that we could do publicly after 5 p.m. So if there are questions that I can answer and you wish to pose them to our New Market Tax Credit Counsel, we could postpone consideration and make that happen. But I'd be happy to attempt to answer any questions that you might have.
Any questions of Mr. Scragg?
I have a few questions. First of all, thanks again for wading through all of this. I know it's kind of a maiden voyage for you and
Definitely
us as well. The timeline that's on, I got a couple questions on the blue sheet and then through the terms on this as well. And some of my questions will kind of bleed back over into 7.2 because some of them are quite related to the Qualic B. And that is what is the timing on that we need to set that up? And in regard to that, what in so much as the request for an exemption from Board of Tax Appeals at the state level, if that can't happen till after construction and so on, what is I'm looking for a what if,
Right.
and what if that.
Well, actually, I'm sorry to interrupt. The use of IRBs negates the need for the Board of Tax Appeals. So that's the reason for the first action, was to provide a more expedient way to address that issue.
Okay, that's for looking for tax exempt on building materials and stuff. I'm looking.
No, the IRB would make it property tax exempt as well. So it'd both be exemption from sales tax on the materials as well as a property tax exemption,
And that
which would then negate the need for a Board of Tax Appeals
And so that would run
application.
for the duration of the 84 months
Yes.
obligation. Okay. All right. Well, that helps to clear that one up. Okay. And then, so the timing on that, when would that?
I mentioned that there'd be a couple of items coming next week. Formation of the Qualic B and the leveraged lender would be on your agenda next week.
Okay. What's the leverage lender entity? What kind of entity would that end up being?
Well, its function is to receive the funds from the city of Salina and the stakeholders. And if you remember the diagram, it's that first entity that aggregates those funds, and then it turns around and makes a loan to, it loans those funds to Chase and Dakotas to start the new market tax credit transaction. So ultimately, and Greg maybe it'll be able to speak to this better than I can, but we would make application for that to be a not-for-profit as well. But that status won't be determined until IRS has received the application and processed it.
Okay, so that, because when I read that makes sense. The first time I read the blue sheet on 7.2, it said the initial $9 million for the field house project are deposited with the leverage lender. That's a process thing. It's not have been.
No.
Okay.
It's
All right.
it's yet to happen.
Yeah, I was like, when did that happen? So, okay, that helps.
That would be nice.
Yeah, right. That helps to clear that up. Okay, so that
I
hasn't.
apologize if that wording was confusing. That has definitely not happened yet.
Okay.
Two quick things that might be
yeah.
helpful, Commissioners. Under the industrial revenue bonds, that is a statutory exemption, is why it does not require review by the Board of Tax Appeals. So that's why it's automatic, so to speak, in that it is just statutory, not discretionary in any way by the Board of Tax Appeals. The structure of the two entities that need to be formed, the Qualic B as well as the leverage lender, are both Kansas, or being organized as Kansas not-for-profit corporations, which is, you might be aware, is a function of state law and the statute under which they are formed as Kansas corporate entities. The separate process then, that can be done, it's a matter of mailing them in to the Secretary of State, and that creates the entity. The process as far as the 501c3 status is the process with the Internal Revenue Service, and that is the longer process that follows the incorporation.
Okay. I appreciate that. That makes a lot more, puts a lot more clarity to that. Hopefully we'll be able to do this. I'm looking at page 3 of 21 in the terms.
Okay.
And the fourth paragraph, the long paragraph, the fourth and last paragraph on that page. This is the part that's really tricky to understand. So you've probably spent a lot of time, the put and the call, and what the implications of that might be.
Yes.
Fiscal implications of that could be.
If you recall, as we were talking about whether we wanted to make application for new market tax credits, the issue we probably talked about the most is the same topic that's covered in this paragraph, and that is it's not permissible to agree in advance to transfer ownership back to the recipient in the new market tax credit proceeds. And so this sets up a put-call scenario whereby the owner can transfer it to us for $1,000, which typically is what happens. And the conversation that we had was in the new market tax credit world, the financial benefit comes from the new market tax credits and the sale of those new market tax credits. And this is kind of the closeout procedure after the deal has been in place for the required 7 years. This is the unwind. For $1,000, they transfer ownership and they move on from the project. So the put is the $1,000 transaction that is elected by the qualic B, essentially, or the investors. In the event that that shouldn't happen, the call would be that we have the option to say we want to make purchase at the fair market value of the debt, not the facility, not what it costs to build into the replacement value, but of the value of the loan. And the assurances that we received are, if anyone ever took our project to that status, that would be so out of the norm with new market tax credit transactions that they wouldn't do any more new market tax credit transactions. So we had to put some reliance on even though you couldn't reduce it to writing in advance, the normal procedure is that $1,000 put. But the calculated value of that loan, and I don't want to hazard a guess, but it is significantly less than the value of the structure.
The value of the loan was like 2.7. That's what you're talking about.
Yeah, and the present value of it is much less than that. I mean, it's in the hundreds of thousands, if that. Okay. But again, that could not be quantified as part of the agreement on the front end either. And then the third item is potentially that it could just become the absolute worst case scenario is it becomes the ownership and operation and responsibility of the investors, which really isn't why they got into this deal in the first place. They got into it for the financial benefit, not to run a field house in Salina, Kansas.
Right.
Okay, anybody else have any commissioners have any? You have anything else, Commissioner? Blanchard?
Me?
You have anything else? Okay, anything else? Okay, any public comment? Okay. I'll entertain a motion for passage of resolution number 167357.
I move that we approve resolution number 16-7357, authorizing approval of a new market tax credits term sheet for financing the Salina Fieldhouse project.
Second.
I have a motion and a second to approve resolution 167357, authorizing the mayor to sign a new markets tax credits term sheet for the financing of the Salina Fieldhouse. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Okay.
Madam Mayor, could I ask a question
passes.
of staff on the, you say there's an upcoming couple of meetings on the field house.
Yes.
Are any of those are we going to have an opportunity to discuss some of the operational and programming aspects of that at that time? I mean, those were some of the key components of of the, and I know that new market tax credits kind of have a little component of some of that in it as well. But are there any, I mean, and maybe that's in the form of a development agreement? Are we going to have any sort of development agreement per se, or is there?
With respect to new market tax credits, I don't know that that's an item that we would need to discuss and act on, but I'll defer to the city manager. in terms
I'm
of-
not. Yeah, I didn't want to conflate that with new market tax credits, but I'm just saying that I know that there were programming may be part of that qualifying.
Yeah, there are certain programming aspects that are related to the new market tax credit process. So those are questions certainly we can entertain at that time. Anything else on programming? You can always ask questions. If not under that item, you can do it under other business if it's on other programming questions. So certainly feel free to do that. But there are, and I think when we get further, there will be aspects of use that are related to new market tax credits. That'll be part of the presentation.
There is an aspect as it relates to what they call community benefit. The new market tax credit financing is looking for community benefit in terms of benefiting low income and benefiting community health. So I'm having conversations with them about uses that might be able to be made of the facility to meet those requirements. But that's all from the expectation that doesn't conflict with the primary purpose of the facility as a practice and tournament facility. And so if that's what you're referring to, as we finalize our conversation with Dakotas and Chase, I'll be better able to say what it is that they would like to see and bring that back to you.
Okay. Yeah, just more generally, I was just wondering if we were ever going to have a development agreement with that dealt with operations, programming, and then
Right.
a operating subsidy, that
The
3-year subsidy that we were.
The Qualic B will turn around and lease it to the city for operation and maintenance. So in terms of a development agreement there, it would basically be assignment of the operation and maintenance of the facility, and then actual programming would be through the Parks Department. In terms of the operational cost and subsidy, that's a little bit more outside of the new market tax credit transaction.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
Commissioner,
like
it sounds
I said,
like you're alluding a little bit more to the kind of the original concept and the partnership with the private donors group.
Right.
Yeah, I would say when we bring that other item, it is a little bit different from that piece, but I think anytime we want to bring that up, we can certainly talk about it to the degree that we can. So,
Okay.
sure.
So you're saying next week we just have a couple of more new market tax credit items? Okay.
That's not the
I'm
end,
sorry,
but
I probably, I
Right.
didn't mean to conflate the two. I was kind of just talking in general terms. So,
Okay.
Okay.
As Greg mentioned, we'll need to make application to form the Qualic B and the leveraged lender, which will take city commission action, which is what we have planned for next week.
Okay.
Okay, we'll go on to development
you.
business. 8.1.
Second reading ordinance number 16-10834, amending Salina Code Section 36-40 pertaining to the criteria for reviewing preliminary plats.
Mr. Andrew.
Commissioners, this item and then the next one that you have on your agenda sort of interrelate. Dean is going to present on these, and we'll have him go ahead and do this item. This item we're very comfortable with you considering and possibly moving forward with this afternoon. The second one, as we get into the next item, I'll have a few kind of things to say to kind of create some context for you. So, Dean?
From the perspective of the Planning Commission and staff, these two items are interrelated, and the goal is based on some of the discussion that has occurred as residential subdivisions have come forward, but from the Planning Commission to the governing body. The goal was to amend the section dealing with preliminary plats to establish some clear criteria as far as what will be the points of how a plat is evaluated, and then similar to what the Planning Commission does on a zoning case or a conditional use case, they would be expected to make findings as to how the plat that was before them conformed with these items. This was approved on first reading at your May 23rd meeting, and then what we have done for second reading is there was a subpoint 3 that dealt with property being inside or abutting the city limits and adjacent to existing development supported by infrastructure, and we have taken that subpoint and expanded it into subpoints 4 and 5 so that it is more specific as to the infrastructure aspects and to the public service aspects. So what our expectation is that any time that a plat is filed, as well as for commercial and industrial plats that are preliminary, that it would be evaluated based on these criteria, and the expectation would be that staff would write a report that would address how a plat addresses each of these items. But in terms of the this is essentially the same list or criteria that the Planning Commission developed. The difference between first and second reading is that what was a single subpoint 3 has been expanded to include subpoints 4 and 5, which are more specific about what constitutes public infrastructure and what is meant by adequate public services. So that would include police, fire, parks, and schools as part of that analysis. So with that, I'd be open to any questions you have about those changes, but this is coming to you as a second reading, and we're comfortable that this reflects no changes from substantive changes from the first reading or from what the Planning Commission enacted, but we think it better clarifies what we mean by adequate public infrastructure and adequate public services.
Any questions of staff?
Thank you.
Ordinance number 16-10834 was passed on first reading on May 23, 2016, and since that time, no comments have been received. Any public comments tonight? Otherwise, I'll entertain a motion to pass ordinance number 16-10834 on second reading.
Mayor, if I may, it would be helpful if the motion referred to approval on second reading as amended.
As amended,
Yes.
okay. I'll entertain a motion to pass ordinance number 16-10834 as amended on second reading.
So moved.
Have a motion and a second? Is there a second, I should say? I have a second, okay. I have a motion and a second. Would you call roll, please?
Mayor Crawford,
Aye.
Commissioner Davis,
Aye.
Commissioner Hardy,
Aye.
Commissioner Ryan,
Aye.
Commissioner Blanchard.
Aye.
Motion passes 5-0. Okay, 8.2.
Second reading ordinance number 16-10835, requesting a comprehensive review and amendment to section 36-74 and 36-74.1 of the Salina Subdivision Regulations and Planning Commission Policies number 88-1 and 04-1 to address frontage requirements, access requirements, improvement standards, and fair share funding mechanisms for perimeter streets abutting new subdivisions.
Before I give a summary of what we've done here for second reading, I'm going to let the city manager give you a summary of some of the work that's been done behind the scenes since first reading.
Thank you, Dean. As you know, this is a follow-up to your first reading that you had not too long ago. And at that time, there were a few things that, some updates that needed to happen, some kind of dot and I's, cross and T's pieces that needed to be put in here. And Dean will take you through that when he comes back. But part of the process for this is it came through. We knew that dealing with the funding of perimeter streets was one of the issues that had come up in prior development conversations for residential development primarily, though you could apply it to commercial as well. And in that, that became a sort of an emphasis or priority of the governing body. So we wanted to work pretty hard on this. After we brought back the first reading that came as a form of a recommendation from the Planning Commission, and the Planning Commission did have hearings and so forth, or hearing and input on that. We began to make the changes to a second reading, but we also had previously, staff had spoken with a group of some of the bankers because we were trying to get a better feel of the lending environment for particularly residential subdivisions in Salina, rather than assume that. And also talked with some of our residential developers, those who actually bring plats to the governing body for approval for development, what you typically see. We've talked a lot about the greenfield or fringe development. So in that, one of the things that came to mind when we looked at this and came out of that conversation is the possibility of the impact of this perhaps being significant enough, at least based on our local conditions, that it might create the cost attached to complying with this might actually be a hindrance to at least some, if not most of our, or maybe all, of what we would consider to be our local residential developers being able to utilize it and moving forward with any of that type of residential development. And that's basically what came out of the conversation. With a lot of other conversation about other approaches and so forth. And I'm not going to bog down today's conversation with all of that because that needs its own time. But what we'd like to do is have Dean go ahead and take you through this so you feel comfortable with what your second reading does for what you approved last time you addressed this. And then before you go into any action, we'll talk about the timing implications, because what I want to do is first talk a little bit more in detail about that. Allow, if they desire, anyone who's here that is involved with residential development to provide their thoughts to you from a financial or cost perspective. And then if you feel like this might not be, and you may feel like you're comfortable with this, you might feel like this is something that you may not want to approve. That's up to you to decide. But if you should choose that you're not comfortable with it at this point, we would recommend roughly, Greg will give you the time, but roughly a 60-day-ish, pretty close to 60-day postponement of the action, and which would also affect that moratorium that was approved. I can't remember how long ago that was that 90 days roughly? And kind of tie those timelines together and kick them out another 60 days by extending the moratorium. And if we do that, then if you should choose to talk further about perimeter streets, we can come back with a study session and talk in more detail about some alternative approaches. It's really up to you, but we'll come. What I'm trying to say right now is that after Dean's finished and you've kind of dealt with the second reading and how you think that fits and your comfort level with that, before you take action, we'd like to come back and talk more broadly. We could. So,
are there any plans in the queue or before the Planning Commission that are directly affected by the moratorium right now?
Oh, I'd say there's a subdivision that we're aware of that I think would be affected or could be affected at least by the moratorium, certainly. So timing is of essence, and even with that, we've made contact with the developer, and I think feel comfortable that the timing can work at this point. If you should need more time to look at different solutions, so we would for sure let you know if that wasn't the case, and we did check. So very good question. With that, Dean, if you want to go ahead and hit the second reading pieces, and then we can talk about that and then go from there.
Well, what we have done between first and second reading in the blue sheet that was presented and also the report given to the Planning Commission, there were a lot of terms, and so the advice of the city attorney was to start out the section of the ordinance by trying to clearly define what those various phrases mean so that they're not just in a report, but that they're actually part of the body of the subdivision regulations. And so on the first section there are sections A through F, and defines what a city street standard is, and a city street standard is what you would typically see as an internal public street in a subdivision. You're going to have a street that's anywhere from 28 to 33 feet wide. It's going to have curbs, gutters, storm sewers, sidewalks on both sides, 6 inches of concrete or 8 inches of asphalt pavement. That is what you see on a internal subdivision street. So that would be the standard city street. A complete street standard is a concept that is in the comprehensive plan that would be closer to what you see on East Magnolia Road or on Iron Avenue. That takes into account not just the automobile lanes, but it also takes in sidewalks that are above just the typical sidewalk, the possibility of an adjoining multi-use trail to accommodate bicycles and pedestrians, and also taking into account bus transit stops. An impact street is a higher level of a complete street, meaning that we've gone over and above with benches, perhaps with public art, with supplemental landscaping, enhanced crosswalks, things of that nature. And so that is clearly defined. What we mean by an interim street standard is defined there by you might have a street that is either unbuilt or it is in a gravel or near gravel condition, something we've inherited from the county in that condition. An interim street standard means you're going in and you're making it a paved surface, but it's likely not to have curb and gutter. It's likely to have just the paved surface with roadside ditches, and the actual design of that would be based on the projected traffic, the vehicle loads, whether it's an arterial or local street. The term perimeter street or road is defined, and then the final term there is a suitably improved street or road. And the example that we gave was Markley Road, which has at least 24 feet of paving. It has 8 inches of asphalt thickness. So at the time that Magnolia Hills Estates was developed there on the east side of Markley Road, that was considered to be a suitably improved street or road. The other, just a reorientation, city attorney felt that having the phrases first and then dealing with access points or the access into a subdivision was moved ahead of all the discussion about improvements. And so what the primary change is that it basically establishes the city street standard as the standard. And so even if a developer has an abutting street such as South Ohio or Markley Road that might be might meet the suitably improved standard, they would still have to make a request to the governing body to be allowed to develop on that street without having to make any further improvements. So if they make a request and say it's not feasible as part of their development to upgrade that to city street standards, then if the city commission makes that as a finding, then they could develop without any further improvements being made to that street. But if you are in a situation where the street is not suitably improved, then the options are for the developer either to upgrade that gravel road to a city street standard, or they can come before you and as part of a development agreement, which is subject to your discretion, they can put forth a plan for how that would be improved. And one of the options on the table is to do an interim standard as opposed to a full city street standard based on the location, the circumstances, that type of thing. But it would still require, even if they did that interim street standard, that they would have to make a payment or cash deposit with the city for 2/3 of their proportionate share of upgrading that to a city standard in the future. And I think the question came up at the previous meeting what current cost meant, and that would be based on the current cost in 2016 dollars for improving that to a city street standard. And it wouldn't be projecting out as to, it might be 5 years, it might be 10 years. The cost estimate would be based on the current cost of that improvement. That is an outline of the primary changes. There was a change made to the table on 3674.1. We were trying to go into the table and be more detailed about the other options, but what we settled on was basically we have a base table, and then footnote number 1 says that if we have an arterial collector street and it's a complete street or impact street, then the Planning Commission has the discretion, and you have the discretion to require that additional right-of-way be dedicated. So what we have learned is that if you have a standard 100-foot arterial right-of-way, but if you want to have a recreational trail beside it, or if you want to have medians that are landscaped in the center of that, you may need 110, 120 feet of right-of-way. So footnote 1 there basically states that on an arterial collector street that's a complete street or impact street, additional right-of-way and pavement width may be required as necessary to meet the applicable standard. So we were trying to address that in the table, and we just added that as a footnote because it's going to vary depending on circumstances, the design, whether we have a 8-foot trail or we don't, or whether we have medians or we don't. So it's going to depend on the vision for that street. So that were the main points there, but what you don't see in the ordinance and in the text is that there are costs and there are dollar signs attached to each of those standards and to each of those requirements, and that is the part that staff has been working through and having discussions with the developers and bankers on that. So I'm going to turn that back over to the city manager to discuss the cost implications of these standards and the language.
Commissioners, before we do that, there's we did talk a little bit after this definition was created, and felt like on the subsection F of section 1, where it talks about the suitably improved street or road, meaning the existing road, whether it's suitable or not in its current form, that we needed to add a condition aspect to that. And the thought being is it could, it's a perimeter road, okay, fine. It could have asphalt or concrete, that's fine. At least 24 feet wide, that's fine. Minimum thickness of 8 inches of asphalt or 6 inches of concrete, that's fine. But if it's rolled and broken up, we probably don't want it and don't want to consider it suitable. So we talked a little bit about how to add a factor in there for condition, because we wouldn't want to take a horrible street regardless if it meets those requirements. So Greg has some language for that.
Certainly, one approach that could be taken to address that would be to expand that definition of, under subpoint F, of suitably improved street or road by adding and which meets the applicable American Society of Testing and Materials Standard D 6433, with a pavement condition index rating of, that would be whatever you might wish to set it at. I think staff thought possibly 80 or greater would be the appropriate pavement condition index. I didn't make all that up. That's actually actually based on consultation with the city engineer as to what would be an appropriate measure of condition.
That was under 1F.
That was the thought of addressing that definition of suitably improved street or road. Those would be the ones that we would be taking on, so to speak. The interim street standard is different in that that would be determined on a case-by-case basis by the city engineer on that 30-year standard. So the interim would anticipate new construction.
One thing you do notice, too, on the interim street standard, which means the street that would have to be built, that does not meet the city standard, doesn't have the curb and gutter, buried drainage, but it's that 24-foot wide asphalt or concrete street. You'll notice that part of that we make reference, to the 30-year pavement design determined by the city engineer based on a soils analysis. So we wanted to make sure and get the soils aspect in because we recognize not all soils are the same. So, and that it's a good practice to be looking at the soils as you design your base and not presume the bases or the soil is going to be all the same. So I want to point that out. But before we get into maybe the broader aspect of some of this and the application issues, perhaps might be good if you'd like to see what questions you have specifically about this approach and how it's applied. and try to work through those, and then we can transition over maybe to the broader conversation, if you'd like.
What question, would this be appropriate time to discuss how these choices of roads would be affected by financing? I mean, I'll ask the question, and if it's better for later, we'll just move it to later.
Yeah,
But,
we can
it's
go
a little more
either way.
specific. Would it be easier, because with one of the scenarios, the developer would be able to request a hardship to build a interim street standard as opposed to city street standard. I'm just wondering if it'd be easier at the time Planning Commission reviews this to determine which one of those roads would be appropriate for this subdivision, regardless of the financing method, and not
Yeah.
and take out that step of having to apply for the lower standard.
The point of the step is that it depends on what you want to be your base standard. If we want the full city standard to be our base standard, one of the concerns is that we develop so slowly, at least in certain places, that you might have you might strand infrastructure costs, curb and gutter and so forth, that you would rather put in later when you have more development. So that's why we created what I'll call the lower standard, or a standard that's pretty consistent with the Planning Commission policy we've been under for I think since '88, I believe. Yeah. So the interim standard sort of mirrors that, and it says, okay, our real standard is this, but if there's a financial hardship, we'll go down to the interim standard. And the point of the affidavit, I want to talk about that a little bit too. The point of that is because the thought being is that there's certain private financial information that if I'm a residential developer, I don't think I want to be talking about in front of the camera in the world. So the point of the affidavit is just a simple legal instrument that their word is their word and a legal instrument. So it's a pretty easy way to say, I can't do it or I can't do it with the cost of the full standard. Therefore, I'm going to request the interim standard and be granted that.
But would there be a situation in which the Planning Commission would say, well, based on what's perhaps on the other side of the street, we insist that this be the city street standard?
I see what you're saying. Depends on how much that area is developed in the first place as to whether we would say, well, instead of a bunch of greenfield on the other side and maybe north or south or whichever direction, it's already fairly well developed under the past practices, which did not get us an urban street. And now we have this subdivision, and let's go ahead and do the urban street right now.
Or where it's known that there are plans for fairly immediate development on the other side.
I think that's a good question. I actually need to read into this closer to see if it really provides for that. Now, the practical aspect of that is you have a cost that would be attributed currently to an interim standard, and if we don't want to do the interim standard, then there's a question as to whether or not if you presume there was already an interim standard, you have to start from scratch to go to the city standard. That's kind of there's some design factors in that, and there's some age factors that have to do with that. So it might be easy to presume you're going to start from scratch and anyway, anytime in the future. Or you could say, well, if we design it properly, maybe you don't entirely. It's a question that the engineers could probably help out with. If the presumption is that you're going to start from scratch anyway, in other words, there's no value to an interim standard, then there would be no reason to take value for an interim standard today if we're going to go straight to the higher standard, right? And so the approach today is the proportionate share of 2/3 of the higher standard. So if we wanted to go to that, at least the intent of this, we'd have to make sure the language is solid, but the intent of this would say, well, developer will figure out the benefiting area that serves this this portion of street that needs to be upgraded. What percentage of it is attributable to your subdivision? Let's just make up a percentage and say 1/3. And then from that, we'll have to estimate the full cost of the full city street at that standard, at the city standard. And then according to this, would knock off 1/3, because the third is a presumption that the city would carry 1/3. So there would be 2/3 of the total cost of the city standard street, and then the 30% of that, or the 33%, whatever that would be, is the proportionate share. So the way it really should work is that if we jump to the urban standard, then we're not even talking about an interim standard. We're probably right into the urban standard piece of it. I'd have to probably refer back to Greg or Dean to see what their interpretation is, if they believe that we could do that, or if we need some transition language under that circumstance.
Whose responsibility is it to maintain that road at an interim city standard?
Well, once the road is there, it's going to be the city's responsibility to maintain like it would any public street.
Okay. Is there any definition as to what determines, is there a definition for interim?
As far as the interim street standard?
Yeah.
Yeah, in subsection 1D, it defines it as it means a street improvement with a concrete or asphalt paved surface consisting of pavement at least 24 feet in width and a 30-year pavement design determined by the city engineer based on a soils analysis, projected traffic volumes, and vehicle loads in the classification of the street. So those would be the factors. And so what would happen is if the engineer of the developer submits that street design, we would run it through our folks, and they would have to say it meets those criteria.
So interim, though, I mean, as far as is interim
Time
5 years, 10 years,
okay.
20 years, forever?
Yeah, this doesn't address time because, quite honestly, we felt that as a governing body, you may not want to be, and you shouldn't, and you really can't probably obligate yourself to say on year X or under certain circumstances you have to then build to an urban standard. We really feel like you, not only legally but practically, want to be able to utilize your own discretion to do that. Now, if we wanted some guidance, we could have guidance as long as it's not binding, so that one governing body or a policy doesn't bind a future governing body to potentially say, for example, if the vehicle volume equals X per day, or if the development saturation around the street segment equals however we want to define that. So you could put together factors that get you to that point to help you do that. But if you do, we would suggest that you don't, I don't even think you could possibly, and it's a good question for Greg, but I don't think you could bind yourself, and you wouldn't want to bind the city to that. But once you have that resource, that 1/3 or proportionate share of the 2/3 from the developer at that point, if the city standard is out into the future, a different question than what was asked, but if it's out in the future, at that point, it really is to leave the discretion up to the city as to when that city standard is constructed. And what would happen is and then the next step is, well, who carries the difference? You have roughly a proportionate share of 2/3. Who pays the difference? Well, according to this presumes the city's going to pick up 1/3. That's another reason you want to obviously have a discretion. And so then if other property develops before the full standard's constructed, then we don't have to have it in here. But what we would do is we'd be recommending a cost recovery mechanism. And actually, in this particular case, now that I think about it, if it's before we construct, it'd be the same approach as here, and they would have to provide their proportionate share of 2/3. So you'd be adding that up as you go, and then when you construct, let's pretend that there's some greenfield space still not developed that benefits from that street, but the street now is built. We would place a cost recovery obligation on top of that vacant property, and then later in the future when it develops, we would recover, not knowing for sure when that would be. So you'd collect along the way as the area develops until the street's built, and once it's built, we still put the obligation, and when the rest of the area develops, it would need to pay in.
How many existing roads do we have now that kind of would fall into the category of interim street standard?
Well, we have quite a few now. If we look at all the uses around, we've got most of our perimeter streets, and I'll rattle some off, and Dean can tell me how many I've forgotten, but the ones that we would expect would develop, we have homes on the east side of town, clearly. There's Magnolia still has a small section that would be an interim street that hasn't been developed east of the bridge. And then potentially as far as homes and long-term development time frame. We have East Country Club. We have, we still could have South Ohio. We still have some water well. Those are probably. Yeah, that's a good point. East Cloud. Yeah, very good point. East Cloud.
Right.
Good one.
Cedar Ridge.
Cedar Ridge.
Yeah, those two.
What about North Street? Would that not?
No, North Street's been improved, hasn't it?
Well, North Street, if we're talking about from Ohio East,
That's what I was thinking.
it's improved when you go past the park. I believe past Great Plains. There's a point back in the Great Plains area where it goes to unimproved and would. And
Yeah,
and
that's
when
true.
when we say that, I want to be clear. Those are streets that we would look at that might meet the suitably improved street standard. We don't know that for sure, but those would be the ones we'd look at and say, okay, does this meet the suitably improved? Does it have the width? Does it have the condition? Does it have the amount of asphalt or concrete?
But at the point that, say, Cloud and Cedar Ridge and maybe a couple of other these streets are clearly to a point now where they ought to be brought up to, they ought to be up to the city street standard because there's development all around them. That's 100% on the taxpayer.
Yeah, I mean, especially when you look back at our past processes, and there's not been a one-size-fits-all approach. There's been different scenarios. There's been scenarios in which we could form a benefit district. It might be a partial benefit district. South Marymount's a good example. I believe that was 35% private. Is that correct, Dean? And the 65% public. And that's basically because when you're in the situation where you can't require a benefit district be formed, or it's subject to protest, you're kind of subject to whatever you can negotiate there. So as the area develops around it, certainly it weakens our ability to cost recover for that unless we have the proper tool put up and placed on the properties ahead of time. And so even with a tool like this, you are going to be looking at existing areas, some of which may already be developed, and you may or may not get much impact from this tool. And low streets, if a benefit district can't be formed, are simply going to be at the at large a cost that's at large to the city and to the city government and the public. And so that's going to happen. If you have areas that haven't seen any develop on any side, you're starting fresh, you'll be able to apply this or some other approach that eventually you'll be able to collect, but it would be based on the development of that area. And again, in Salina, when we're about 60 to 70 homes per year, that's a pretty small percentage. We talk about probably total of, I'm going to guesstimate 17,000 plus or minus single-family type units. And so it's very slow at about 0.3 to 0.4% development pace a year. And so the part of the challenge is that somebody's going to have to carry, if we're going to develop in those areas, somebody's going to have to carry what I'll call the trunks, the trunk water mains, trunk sewer mains, and then call them the collector type streets. And if the developer cannot, and if you want to see development, then the city would have to, and then the city would collect at what we think is reasonable from our perspective and the developer's perspective initially, and then try to collect in time, though it would likely be fairly slow based on the patterns we have. It's just what you have to deal with when you develop slowly. So those are some of the challenges you have to weigh.
Sarah, what would be, since we're looking at mainly this covering perimeter type application, where we're looking at streets that would be improved and probably simultaneously being brought into the city, being annexed. You see, what do you see in the future, sort of a policy or an approach? I know we've talked about it in the past. What would be a reasonable approach to say, if we're going to annex part of, and let's just use Holmes, we're going to annex a portion of Holmes. Is there some thought to we ought to annex a reasonable, efficient portion of Holmes to maintain versus like on Ohio, you go down 150 feet and it's in the city and the rest of it isn't? I mean, is there any thought to what the fiscal note on that would be if you're looking at, okay, we don't want to just, and I think in the last meeting kind of posed it in the sense of, are we talking about the street in front of the property at the frontage, or are we looking at a bigger cost if we're going to say, let's don't annex anything less than a half mile at a time because it causes headaches?
Yeah, we have some flexibility there. With regards to the development, I think the development will dictate the area annexed, minimally the area annexed, which would probably be from end to end of where the development's adjacent to the street. Now, what you ask is a very good question, as we've talked about the road annexation as it relates to Salina County. And in that, we've hammered to death over the last few years that statute and the noticing up, which I think is a problem because not all parcels are very large. And from a planning perspective, from a public a maintenance response perspective, and a public safety response perspective, it doesn't, to me, make much sense on the perimeter of your community to be in the city limits, out of the city limits, in the city limits, out of the city limits. So in a broader sense of just roadway annexation in itself, I think that it would be good for both the city and the Salina County to have a policy where we're dealing with, whether it's a half mile or a full mile increment, a fairly significant increment, where we say, okay, here are the criteria. It now meets those criteria. We're all aware of those. We've negotiated those. Now it's ready for that roadway segment to come into the city for maintenance. And so that's what we'd hope to have in the future. It's a little bit different because the development could and probably would dictate increments not like that, although I'm sure Saline County would be happy to give you, certain number of feet, as many as you want, along that same roadway to the north, to the south, to the east, or to the west. So if we did create some kind of a deal with them on how we annex roadways, we could certainly take some of the same logic and apply it if we have a small segment here, if we should choose to do that. The trade-off is you get some better planning opportunities when you have a larger section of the street, and you can regulate what goes on with regards to access and so forth, and plan for that. The negative is you, in all likelihood, take over the maintenance costs. You do have more maintenance there as well. So that's kind of what you trade off.
And then when we talk about, Dean mentioned 100-foot right-of-way versus maybe if you go to a different standard, 110 to 120 or whatever. What are the implications of if you're at the city limit and you say, I want to take 110-foot right-of-way? Well, out in the county, the road record goes to the center line. Is there a takings issue with the property owner across the street? What is the...
Yeah, if you're in a development scenario, you have the ability through the plat to go from center line in. Let's just say we're talking about 100-foot right-of-way for whatever the designation of street is. You could get your 50 feet because you go from the center line into the development. But if the property across the street is not developed yet and is in rural Saline County, at that point, you would probably, in all likelihood, be taking the half that's available from the road record. They don't typically deal with right-of-way. It's usually called road record. We call it's like an easement. So you're not going to get the additional right-of-way on that side of the road unless you either purchase it, acquire it. You potentially could use eminent domain depending on the circumstances, or when that does develop, you could acquire it as part of the development in the same way you did the section across the street.
How would, you said you talked, or some of the staff talked to some banking institutions about this, and what was their
What we
take on
what we
this?
wanted to do, we were able to talk with I think 5 of our local bankers, and what we wanted to get sort of a general idea as from a lending perspective as to what type of lending is available for a residential property developer, because it's sometimes come up in our conversation. We felt the best place to go is to those who do it, rather than to presume. And so what we were told basically, and there are a lot of factors. There is the biggest factor is the carrying capacity of the borrower. Do they have significant assets that they can place on the line? Do they have a lot of cash? We don't typically see a lot of that, but what do they have? What's their carrying capacity in good times and in bad? What's the current development climate and so forth? They look at all of that, and I think there was general consensus that the very best, for example, whoever it would be that has the best carrying capacity, the lowest risk opportunity for the lender, if we said, okay, what percentage of the total cost of development would you loan that particular person? 60 to 65 was at the very high end. And what we're talking about is the total project. Land, in this case, let's assume there aren't any specials. Land at probably 20 to 30, 35,000 an acre. Engineering, $50,000 to $100,000, depending on the scope and size of the subdivision. And then the biggest would be the infrastructure. If there are no specials, our cost would indicate that range, that's probably about $30,000 a lot. You can figure roughly about 3 lots per acre, so about $90,000 per acre. So if it's a 10-acre subdivision, which is fairly small, it's about 30 lots, somewhere around $900,000. Part of what we got to is it doesn't take long on even a small scale to get between $1.5 million and $2 million total cost if it's 100%. And the indication is if there were no specials involved, the most that would be loaned would be 60 to 65%, and that's of the best borrower with the lowest risk to the lender.
What did you have a meeting with the developers, or?
Yeah, we followed up separate from that meeting and had conversations, and talked with the residential developers to get a feel from their perspective as well. And a few things that came out of that. Part of it is that even with specials, and the bankers are very clear, specials aren't this other pot of money, this other free pot of money. The reason is because if I'm going to loan you money, I want to know what your other obligations are, right? Because if you have another obligation, it affects my ability to collect from you on my obligation or the obligation you have with me. So even with specials, there's obviously, until the lots are sold to someone else, there's an obligation from that person or that company to pay the specials, right? Because the specials transfer to the next owner of property, so until the lot's sold, they stay with the developer. So that's still a factor. It's not like free money from their perspective, but they do believe, based on the application of specials, there's a stabilizing factor. So they do generally like the subdivision better if there's specials. The other piece to that that's interesting, and we learned a little bit about, is the financial security. We have a financial security that's equal to 20% in cash of the total cost of the infrastructure, or 35% letter of credit, I believe. And so if you have, I mean, cash is king, right? But if you think about $1.5 million to $2 million subdivision, and you have to come up with 20% cash, that's a lot of cash to tie up. The other side of that, it's even more asset to tie up. If you don't have cash, you tie up 35%, that's a higher percentage. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I mean, there's a reason for financial security. What I'm saying, though, is that that's something else that ties up an asset or cash availability of a developer, and the bank has to look at that as well. So they all have to look at that. Do I have the cash? If you're the developer, do I have the cash, or do I have an asset I can tie up, or did I need to tie up that asset because I'm going to the bank and they need an asset too? And so it all still goes into the same pot and it's mixed up by the lending institution when they're trying to figure out the risk of the development. So those are factors as well. So we did learn that that's a factor for them. It's a cash flow factor for the developer, and we kind of got back and we're talking a little bit about the question of special assessments, because this also all relates. In the end, what is your cost for the full development, on-site and off-site? And so if you could be into a fairly, in Salina, moderate-sized development, $1.5 million to $2 million, the amount of specials is important. And for example, if you can do a project without specials, that doesn't mean, if you can, that's great. Doesn't mean you're going to have money to do off-site. You might not. I think we found that the indication was a lot of the folks could not. And then it's even a question of, even if there are specials applied to the subdivision, how much and what's available. The last special assessment district that was approved was for the final piece of River Trail. I believe that was a 75% special assessment. When I say approved, it was to do the feasibility out of it, but I think at 75%. I don't know what the cost is of that. I didn't ask because that's proprietary. But if you assume $1.5 to $2 million, you can just take 25% of that, and so you're talking about upwards of $300,000 or $400,000 to $500,000. That's not covered by that. Okay, so the person might be able to cover that. They might not. I can't say that. But then if that subdivision was somewhere else, you're talking about a perimeter street or infrastructure, water, sewer, whatever it might be that needs to be extended, and there's some carrying there. You could easily add $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 additional for off-site improvements if you needed to construct and carry the interim road standard, or a water or sewer extension, or even a portion of it. So you could easily add a few $100,000 to that. So that was the concern. And what I don't want to speak. I can't speak specifically for each person and so forth. And so I know there are some folks here, and they may wish to choose to kind of speak from their perspective as well. But that's the general context of the conversation that we had.
Okay, anyone else have any questions of
That design, I don't know if it was it standard or chart or whatever that we were talking about, where you threw out an 80% number. Anyway, that's assuming that 100% is a new condition. Is that what that represents?
I would expect that Mr. Stack would better address that than I.
Oh, you're talking about the index, the condition of the roadway. Yeah, that's based. We have a pavement management system, and Dan will address the ANSI standard, and that number is kind of up to you. And you may have questions about what an 80 might mean versus a 75 or 85.
Yeah, the ASTM, American Society of Testing and Materials, has a standard for evaluating the condition of roads, and that's what our consultant that we had that drove the roads with the van, they use that as try to be as an objective approach as possible to make sure we get the ratings the same or as close to comparable as possible. So 100 is the top of the scale. That it would be a brand new road or a newly constructed road typically. 80 would be a well-maintained, recently overlaid road or one that's in pretty good shape. I'll find out what we have for Markley and Magnolia. They're in pretty good shape right now out there east of town. The Markley, just south of the runway, is in pretty good shape. It's been recently chip sealed. Pretty good base, pretty good asphalt. So I'll just have to figure out what those are, though.
So an 80 could mean that the road has been worn enough so that it has needed repair.
Yeah, normally our asphalt roads have some kind of, maintenance cycle. So yeah, if it's an asphalt road, it will have had either chip seal or microsurfacing or some crack sealing. Typically, that's the case. Unless it's brand new, it's going to take. We can see how many years it takes for a new road to go from 100 to 80, but that's going to take a few years.
So if we were asking that the interim street standard be built to a 30-year pavement design, then we would be giving the suitably improved street or road a little bit of a break. Is that the deal?
Yeah, I mean, if we're going to build a new road, yeah, the suitably improved would be probably less. It'd be one of the roads that we have out there today, like Ohio, South Ohio's one, Markley, Magnolia. They're older streets, but they're in pretty good shape.
So 80 was picked as a
that's just a
dartboard kind of thing?
Number we can try to figure out, give you some examples of what are 75s or what are 85s or what are 80s. We can try to do more of that if that's pertinent or helpful to the discussion.
Is the 80 kind of about where your dips? I remember looking at your charts, the condition-wise, and I mean, it's kind of where you want to be. It's kind of where you at least want to start.
Right. I think it's a good
You
start.
want to get it back up to 80 to.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to get it back up to 100 after it's built.
Well, right,
but,
yeah.
I mean, it's just, if you can keep it above 70 to 80. Now, the ASTM defines that as a pretty good street. So it's keep anywhere in the 80s, that's a really good street.
Yeah, as I recall the study session you did on that kind of seemed like a realistic and still hard to keep up with that, though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've got our new data now from our condition last year, so we can try to see which ones are 80s now or which ones are in that category.
Are we able to classify streets with the equipment that we have?
That ASTM gives you a defined approach. You can do it manually. There is a way to do it manually, yes. But it is nice to have the automated equipment. That's what we've done in the past. So I guess your original question was, can we do that? Yes, we could. Or we've got some staff that can do that.
Yeah, you want it. I would guess you would want it to be consistent because you're picking out a number that costs money.
Mm-hmm.
Are these folks on call at all, or are they thousands of miles away?
Oh, they're probably quite a ways away, but we've got some in Iowa, some in Illinois and Arizona. A lot of cities in the state are using the companies now to do that, so it's not hard to get. If you can piggyback on a trip where they're already coming through, it's not that big a deal. Otherwise, Justin Birch is our cartograph and pavement management expert, and he's evaluated quite a few streets to check some of the data we've had, and so far so good.
Dan, does the pavement management system have any capacity to age a rating?
Yes.
It does, so it can help us even with that aspect.
Yeah, that's one of the big things that we're, as we get more data points of the inspections, then we can start seeing how well is our microsurfacing performing and how fast is it deteriorating after you do a microsurfacing or a mill and inlay or a build. And so I feel like that's the deterioration rate of a road after you do a treatment to it is pretty important. And we're trying to get there. Any other questions on that?
While you're up there, I have a quick question, and this is, while the door's open on this particular section, I'm looking at section 2. Section 36-74.1, subsection A, and it's on the sheet with the table on it. page number 5. The sentence just prior to the table, it says, prior to review of a proposed public street by the city engineer, subgrade soil shall be tested by a geotechnical firm and a report submitted to the city engineer with analysis and recommendations for a 30-year design pavement section. That, is it helpful? I mean, that kind of right there is kind of open-ended. That is, of course, at the expense of the petitioner / applicant, is it not?
That is the intent, yes.
Yes.
Okay, are those done because,
This is proposed, we'd like these to be done, correct?
okay, so is this a little bit new language then? Because it looked
Yes.
like it was a little bit different.
Yeah, that's new
Oh,
language.
yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Right.
Yes.
You guys have talked about this and asked for it, and we figured we might as well
Okay,
just
yeah,
stick it in here.
well,
Yeah,
okay,
we
Make it
wanted to
as
get
clear
away
as
from
possible.
practice that
Right.
moves around a little bit and nail it down.
right,
so
so
that is
this
new
kind of
language.
requires
Yes.
that
Yes.
that be done.
Yep,
Okay,
correct.
excellent, okay.
Real quick on a past question, the question had to do with if we wanted to, if you as a governing body said this area is developed enough, we want to go straight to a city standard street. In consulting with Greg, he feels like the language is sufficient that you could waive the interim and go straight to the interim standard if you want, and then you're looking at the proportionate share of 2/3, which you would collect anyway under the interim, but you're not going to require the construction of the interim in that case. So it actually is probably better in that case for the residential developer if that's applied, because they don't have to fool with carrying an interim standard because you're ready to go straight up to the full standard. But in that particular case, what the question is going to be is the city ready to carry the rest of the cost of the full city standard? Because that's what the policy would suggest. So that would be the real policy question there. But you could do that. You could choose to.
How have we taken care of these in the past?
A lot of different ways. We've used the special assessment districts and consensus specials in a lot of different ways, and sometimes they're helpful. Like we were mentioning before, if most of the area is undeveloped, those are fairly helpful. Although, if you are a homeowner and you've paid specials for streets inside your subdivision, you're not real happy to find out later, even though we say you should have seen it when you bought, you're not happy to find out later you've got specials potentially waiting for you on a collector street. But we have used that tool. But I don't believe you can use that in perpetuity and timing, so the pace of development is a factor with using that tool. And then as we talk more about that Cedar Ridge and East Cloud, east of Ohio Street, the more that's developed, the more difficult it is to form a district, because in essence, you can leverage someone who's wanting to develop a property through the planning process, but when it's already there, you're not able to do that. And so it's about whether you can basically talk the neighborhood into wanting to put the resources together to fund that. And sometimes we can, and sometimes we can't, and the level varies. So it's a fairly inconsistent approach based on that. And I think Dean he's got all the history in his head of all the tools we've used, so he could take you much deeper with how we've done that as well.
So the Planning Commission hasn't seen any of this yet?
What you have in front of you today, the first reading came
First
as a
reading,
recommendation
did.
through the Planning Commission, and then what we did is from your input when you last discussed it, a couple of weeks ago, I think, we amended to fill in some of those blanks. For example, we wanted to be sure that whether someone's dealing with a substantially, or what's the phrase here, get my phrases right, whether it's an interim street standard, or whether it's a suitably improved street standard. Under this scenario, both should have to first look at the full city standard and provide the financial reason, or sign the form and say, I can't do it otherwise, whether you accept the suitably improved, or whether they have to construct an interim street standard. So we wanted to create equity there. And there were a couple other pieces that are in the blue sheet that that was summarized by Dean's blue sheet that filled in the blanks from the conversation. But most of this came through the Planning Commission, except what was changed from your recent conversation.
One quick last question that asked, and this question was kind of brought up a little bit earlier by Commissioner Davis, and that was about the affidavit for hardship. Where is that one again on this sheet?
It's on subsection 3 on page 2 in subsection B.
Subsection 3.
Or it's, yeah.
It's in A.
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 but it's in subsection A
Okay.
and B on page 2 under 3.
Is there, and my question kind of is related to before, like our special assessment policy, when we simply changed it from to give discretion. Is there any discretion on this affidavit, or if the affidavit's submitted, it's like going, okay, hey, you have to honor that hardship. Does the city commission have any discretion whatsoever to say, come on? Is there any way to do it with some sort of discretion? Because, I mean, I can't imagine anybody not going like, well, hey, because we heard before, it's like affordable. Well, it's affordable to some people. Well, what's a hardship? Well, it could be can't go on 2 vacations this year.
We talked about that, and what we're looking at are plating requirements, and plating requirements are intended to be pretty prescriptive. And I think Greg can speak a little further, but depending on discretion you built in, it could create a pretty easy opportunity to be somewhat arbitrary in the application of it. And so part of the approach here is to make sure that that doesn't happen. But I defer to Greg if he wants to add to that.
If I could, and you may address it, and that was the reason I asked the question earlier. Is there a situation in which the Planning Commission would say, no, this has to be the city standard, and there's no point even submitting the affidavit because the only thing we're going to accept here is the city standard street because of probably what's on the other side of the road?
You're talking about the city standard right now.
Right, to be built instead of the interim.
Instead of the interim right now.
Correct.
Do the complete.
Because if the Planning Commission has the ability to, whether they use it frequently or not, say, this has to be city standard, I could almost put up with the affidavits as long as I know that in those times when it has to be a city street, that can be mandated.
Well, that's a good question, and there's a couple aspects when we really look at that. Of course, one is if you have a gravel street and you're considering the city standard versus the interim standard based on the financial hardship. The other is if you already have let's just say that there is a street and we look at it and we say that we believe it meets the suitably improved street or road standard. So you have both of those scenarios, and I'll defer to Greg. I think he's got the answer on his mind. I don't want to, since he gets to interpret this, I don't want to disagree with him, but I'm not sure that discretion's there in all situations. But Greg, you might think it is.
Well, on the initial point about the discretion with regard to but-for test on financial feasibility, as I'm sure you all can imagine, you either take it on its face or you have a system whereby you are scrutinizing financial statements, you're doing whatever it takes
Micromanaging,
to
really.
make that sort of determination. Those are two obviously very different processes. And certainly, as a governing body, it's up to you all, but I think it appeared to be sufficiently difficult and potentially you have to really build a system in order to scrutinize that and make objective determinations. It's not impossible, but it will be difficult.
I think your mic's off.
Oh, sorry.
You have to repeat all that.
Well,
No, you don't.
the way that relates to, I think, what is your question, Commissioner Davis, is if we look at 3B, the scenario where, let's say you have the affidavit and the developer is requesting the opportunity to build the interim street standard. As I understood your question, if in the city's assessment the interim just doesn't work and it's time for the full development, the brief conversation I had with the city manager was along the line that if you're the developer and you qualify for the interim standard, you're still going to have to provide the cash deposit for 2/3 of the city engineer's estimate of your proportionate share of 2/3 of the city engineer's estimate of the current cost of improvement. I was reading just to be sure I spoke correctly. So you're going to be paying that in. So it almost reverses. There's no limitation presently on when the city decides that that standard is to be achieved. And as the developer, you've paid in your share. So it really kind of shifts. In my mind, it shifts back to the city. Presumably you would not say, well, you're going to have to build the interim standard and then we're going to come in next week and build the full standard. It almost puts the onus back on the city to waive the interim standard requirement because, thank you, we'll take your money and we're going to go build it out to the full standard. That was what prompted me to think that if the city chose to move on to the full standard, that's achievable. But I would expect that out of fairness to the developer, then the construction of the interim would be waived.
In addition, and when we're talking about who makes what decision, you don't want to design a process that would somehow grant the planning commission with the somehow the authority, or at least the perceived authority, to say, hey, let's take it to city standard, which means that the city is going to pay for it, and then just simply collect the proportionate share of 2/3. That needs to be a decision that falls with you. So we need to think about how that decision would flow through this. If as Greg mentioned, if it does go to an urban standard, it sounds like you do have the discretion to take it to an urban standard if you waive or city standard if you waive the interim standard, or if you waive the suitably improved. And I presume, Greg, that when you're looking at it, they could say, even if it's suitably improved, we could elevate it to the city standard as well.
No, I don't think under A that,
Okay.
when you're in that scenario, that option is not.
So that's an interesting thing we have to look at, because the interim standard, which is the new street at the less than city standard, and the suitably improved are kind of intended, one's already there, one's not, one's going to be built, but they're sort of intended to be pretty similar. So if I'm the developer, I guess if I get the gravel road, then you could take me up to the urban standard if you want, which is probably not a bad thing, because you're going to take that money from my pocket anyway under this for the urban standard, but the city's going to have to carry it. But if I'm if it's suitably, if it meets the suitably improved definition of a road that's already there, then if you want to be able to elevate that road to the city standard immediately, that would need to be amended, it sounds like.
Does that
I think so.
explanation make the affidavit unnecessary? Because if you're asking, let's say that you start out with the interim street, but at the same time you ask for the proportionate share to build the street standard, city street standard, what's the difference in just starting with interim and then making that decision between interim and city standard as you decide to?
Commissioners, this was designed around an approach. And the approach is that, first of all, that you don't obligate yourself to a project with every development. Now, if I'm a residential developer, I'd love for the city to be already pre-obligated that once I develop, you're going to build the street, and I just have to write my check for my portion if I can afford to do it. Not a bad deal, right? You get the street you want, you get the curb and gutter. You might leave some of that curb and gutter sitting there, not benefiting a lot of folks for a long time, but you could do that. But in this particular case, there's an assumption that, well, we may not want that at a city standard immediately, or we may not want to carry the cost of a city standard immediately. And so what it does is it says, well, on the interim standard, the burden's on the developer to put the street in. On the city standard, the burden's on the city. So if you want to process, it puts the full burden on the city. We could do that. We could write that up for you pretty quickly. But it depends on what you really want.
No, I'm just saying that most developers, in my mind, would be interested in the interim street. That's the most affordable option.
Not for the developer, it's not. And the reason it's not is because if you're at the interim standard, it's more affordable if the developer's carrying the cost. It's more affordable than the city standard because you don't have subsurface drainage and all of that.
Right.
But the way this is set up that the city would expect to carry the cost of the city standard.
Mm-hmm.
The developer would expect to carry the cost of the interim standard. And so unless we switched responsibilities, it's not necessarily.
But the developer would be responsible for their proportionate share to take the road up to the city standard.
Right.
The interim to the city.
Yes. Yeah.
So
But
it doesn't change their
here's
cost,
the
is what I'm saying.
position. No, it actually, if the city says, we just call it the city standard, we don't want an interim standard, we just want a city standard, here's the decision you have to make. You get a development, you have a road, doesn't meet your expectations, it needs to be brought up to a city standard. You have to carry the full cost of that project. I don't know if we can afford to carry the full cost of every project chasing every development. Maybe, maybe not. Depends how you want to use your funds. Okay, the developer puts in their proportionate share of 2/3 if you still fall under that. That's fine. If you should choose not to do that, then you've forced a no vote on the subdivision just based on your decision whether you want to participate with the capital improvement. What this does is it gives an alternate option. And so the developer, if they should choose to carry the interim standard, they don't get a no vote. That's what it's about. It's about saying, we can go to a lower standard. It's not the preferred standard, but you'll go there if, one, financially they say, I've got a hardship, I can't afford to put in the whole city standard for you, and you're not willing to carry the full cost of the urban standard. But if the city wants to carry the urban standard, as Greg said, we want to waive the interim standard. And I think we might want to also potentially then waive the acceptance of the suitably improved as well, because either way, there should be a proportionate share of 1/3 or 2/3 coming in for the city standard. So in that scenario, that's a good deal for the developer because they don't have to carry interim standard and write you a check. So that's a really good deal. The question is that what you want to do every project? And do you want the burden of that decision of if you say, well, we don't want to carry this one because we carried that one and we don't want to carry this one, they're a winner, they're a loser, and as a result, you don't have another option, and it's a no on the subdivision, and they simply can't develop versus to have an option. So that's where we think you get more options here, although in the discussion, we might need to tweak a couple things still, but go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I don't want to jump to conclusions too quickly, but I sense from the discussion and the potential objectives that if that determination of moving to the full city standard is something that the Commission thinks best to retain that discretion, particularly under either of these two scenarios. When I responded to the question earlier, I'm sorry, I should have made the point when talking with Mr. Gage that scenario, I think, works as you interpret the application of a situation where you don't have a suitably improved road and you're looking at building either the interim or the full. But right now, it certainly stands that if you've got a suitably improved roadway, we're not really in a position to dictate that it would advance to the full standard, and certainly we don't have any requirement of the developer's participation at any particular level in that build-out. So if we want to anticipate that regardless of these, even if one of these two circumstances exist and we still want to retain for the city the ability to determine that, yes, we're ready to move to the full city street standard, then I think we can certainly do better on the language anticipating that.
Are there any developers here who would like to speak?
Madam Mayor, Commissioners, Todd Welsh, 221 South Morris Drive. I was going to start out while I was sitting back there thinking this isn't rocket science, but it's getting really close to it.
It is.
I don't even know that I'm smart enough to develop anymore based on all this stuff comes through. Like I just can't even keep track of it anymore. When we first started out, and I go back a little bit, it was about the cost of, what's our exposure as a city, and I think we got over that. Then it got down to just special assessments, and no special assessments, or the developer should take it all upon their own. And I thought we were making a little bit of headway, and I think we still are. And that we've got some excitement by saying, okay, 75-25 with a feasibility study on River Trail. And I think those developers are out still trying to figure out whether they can make that work. And then and I will be the first to say that some earlier developers got away with a lot of stuff that they shouldn't have in this city many, many years ago. I've only been developing or even entertaining developing for probably 5 years, and I would be the first to say, and as I went in front of you, I was the first to say, look, let's raise it from 10 to 25 years on the street for a no protest. And I'm quite frankly, I think they ought to be forever. I don't know that there's a law against that, as I brought that up on saying that it should go on forever. I think somebody said, well, I don't really think you can do that. There has to be an end date of the benefit district for a no protest. But the reason I say that is because who's to say that the east side of town is growing for a certain amount of time, and then all of a sudden the south side becomes again, and 25 years goes by and nothing happens, and then we end up in the same situation with Cloud Street that we have in front of Dillon's, and the same street out on East Crawford Street where everybody in that first phase, they got away with it. Now how do we make Crawford extend to Holmes Road, and who's going to pay for that? And so that's what I'm saying. I'm not standing in front of you as a developer saying that I want to get out of it. I'm trying to figure out how do we make it so it's feasible to be done, and that the city gets a nice road that's impact is great. It's all being taken care of. We're on a plan that in 20 years we know whether it's going to go from an impact to a city street to a full-blown sidewalk trails, and we have this huge plan for it. Like I'm all for that. You can take all the easements you want for that. But what I'm concerned about right now is that it's like when we open up another can of worms, it's like, okay, well, if we do this, then we need this. And then then I go to my bank, and the bank says, okay, well, if you want to buy that piece of ground, I'm going to loan you 60%. And so now I got to come up with $400,000. And then at 25%, I got to come up with another $300,000 of cash for special assessments. And then if I'm on the outside of town and I've got to put this street in, now we want 2/3 up front in cash for the developer, which when we were figuring out Holmes Road, that was like another $300,000, I think, on top. So pretty soon I have to have $1 million of cash to do what this policy is that we're trying to create today. And we can create it. It doesn't really bother me. The land will just sit. And I think I will say that Mr. Gage did a beautiful job in inviting us in a meeting we did. And I think for the very first time, we put it all up on a whiteboard. And I think for the very first time, it kind of scared me. And I just went, I just got to get out of this. Like, how do I get out? Because it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work at all. And my saying has always been before of saying, the people who want to do it maybe don't have the cash to do it. And it would be easy for you guys to say, well, then don't do it. You're not the right guy for it. Well, the guys who have the cash, who are sitting on $1 million, they don't want to do it. I mean, they don't want to go into that whole thing of saying, well, gosh, do I really want to, put my $1 million on risk? And do I really want to work that hard? And do I really want to come down and sit through all this stuff and do that? I've already got my $1 million. Do I really need $1.2 million, to make this thing work? So I'm just standing in front of you, I guess, to say that I don't know where this is headed. I don't know that I'm the right thing. I thought that we were making very good strides with the city manager the other day when we were looking at it and going, we came to a conclusion of going, gosh, could we take this to the city commission? How does 80-20 look? And I looked at the other developers in the room and I went, could you do it for 20%? Could you go get 20% of a development? And they're like, well, I think we could do 20. And as myself, I sit there and go, you know what, I think I could probably go to my bank and I probably could figure out enough collateral, put enough of my stuff up, all of my stuff in there and go, okay, this is worth a project for me doing for about 20%. But at 25, I don't know that I can do it because I've got to come up with a 35% letter of credit or 20% in cash. I've got to pay for a street up front to get to improvements, and I've got to buy the land, and I've got to put the money up front there. It's impossible. It's impossible. I shouldn't say impossible. There could be somebody with money who wants to do that, but I don't see those guys stepping forward. The 4 or 5 guys who stepped in front of us, who sat in that room, who want to make the city of Salina a better place and keep everybody staying here rather than moving away because it gives them an opportunity to purchase, those guys are stepping front, putting plats in front of you to make the city a better place. And I don't see those guys with $1 million in cash. I'd be happy to take any questions.
And they didn't come tonight.
You know, honestly, had I not gotten a phone call from somebody else, I wasn't aware that it was tonight either. Could have been my, maybe you sent out, 5 emails. I could have gotten a letter, but I received a phone call and said, "Are you going tonight?" I didn't know what was going on. So I chose to come here tonight. I'm glad for the phone call.
So is your thought then that the best solution is that the city is responsible for the perimeter roads?
No, not at all. As a developer, what that I'm learning is all of the profit is at the very end, yet you're asking for everything up front. And when I sell a piece of property for $30,000, the bank takes $30,000. I don't get any of that money because I've got a note sitting over there that they want to get paid before I get any money. And so they take it all at the very end. So then on the 80% that, let's say we did the 80-20, I have to pay, when those special assessments come in, let's say I do a 40-lot subdivision and I sell 10, I've got to pay special assessments at about $2,100 on the remaining 40 lots every year until I sell those. So not only did I give you $1 million up front, and my money's just paying back the lots, I'm selling 10 at a time, I've got no cash coming in. I now have to turn around and pay 40 lots at $2,100. I've got to pay another $80,000 to pay off those special assessments for that year. And that's why I'm just standing in front of you going, I'm in a league that is not even, I shouldn't even be here. I'm in a league that it just doesn't even make sense for me to be standing in front of you because I'm not the right guy to do it. But
I thank you for your explaining that, though, because I think the way you explain that to me helps me to understand how that all works.
Yeah,
So
I'm not saying that the developers ought to get scot-free. Just let me do a piece of pie there, and you give me 100% and do all this stuff. I'm just saying there's should be a way that it can happen. I just think there are tools. And as I was visiting with Mr. Gage on there, I was just saying, why can't we do this? And I know there are laws in place. What seems easy to me, he would shut him. Well, you can't do that. It's not part of this benefit district. Or, well, why can't we delay this and put this off in here rather than the money up front? Why can't we put that over onto special assessments for that road that's there? Because they're the ones going to be benefiting. And I think maybe you can't do that. You can't put the special assessments over on that the street that's going to be put in place over there. And so I don't know. I don't even, to be honest with you, I don't even know if this gets voted on tonight, whether this becomes policy. And I don't know whether it needs to be. I don't want to use the word table. I've been on the planning commission. I hate tabling things, and they just seem to go on and on forever. But I do want to make sure that the policy we put in place tonight, whatever that it is, you take into account for, are we actually going to shut it down? And if that's the intent to shut it down, I think that's the way that we're headed, because the developers that are in front of you today cannot put $1 million of cash down to build out what needs to be done.
Is there a scenario then that does not give you a panic attack?
Well, again, as I look at just one piece of it, I think we're making strides of saying that, does the 80-20 make sense on special assessments? As Mr. Blanchard said when I visited with him it could be a year ago, I guess, on there is, hey, you guys were here at 100%. I'm starting at 0, and somewhere we can meet in the middle. And I'm just saying that if the middle is 75-25, then we're done. If the middle is 50-50, we're done. And what we're saying is 80-20 is what we'd like to bring in front of you as something that the developers could live with. And we're setting precedents for years down the road to be done. Now I'm trying to figure out, how do we deal with the street concept of saying, how do we take and I agree with you from the very beginning, the word hardship. What developer isn't going to come in front of you and say, I have a hardship? Every time. And so now we're trying to write language for that, and then we run into stumbling blocks of language of, well, how do we do that? How do I show you a financial statement inside there? But again, I think it makes sense. If a developer came in front of you, I think it's based off traffic count. My hardship would be, hey, I want to develop this property, and here's Holmes Road. I'd like to take it to the interim standard because there's only 600 cars a day going down it, and there's no reason for us to go to city standards. but I'd be happy to. And here's where the tough part comes in. I don't know. I don't know how you get the money from me to build it to city standards at a future date. Because again, now you're asking for a couple $100,000 right up front to build something that doesn't need to be done. And yet then as a developer, I'm trying to say, okay, if I'm going to put $200 up front, how do I get that $200,000 back? I either have to raise the lot price, or I have to somehow throw it within the special assessments to get that basically done. And then again, I don't think you can throw that in the special assessments. If I raise the lot price, now lots are $38,000 on a standard subdivision today. I know I was doing an open house out on Shoreline the other day, and they're $2,100. And as I watch the clients come in the door at $2,100, that's about the line of where it draws at. Well, if we go any higher than about $30,000 for special assessments, now that's going to be $2,400, $2,600, $2,800. And at some point now, lots are going to be $38,000 with specials in $35,000. So you got $70,000 of initial cost in there before we even get started. So I hope that somewhat made sense. I've listened to a lot of things in there, and I'm trying to articulate it the best I can from a layman's term of a developer. I understand that, there are issues with the streets and the cost recovery, and we can't do ag deferrals forever, and it all has to work. And I get that. I'm not standing in front of you saying it should all go away. I'm just saying I hope there's a happy medium that we can all live with without making a decision that is in the best interest of the city, but then shuts down the person on the other end who can't make it work. Any questions?
I'm just thinking about all of the East Cloud type situations we might end up with if we're not able to collect that money to raise an interim street up to a city street standard.
Yeah, and I guess I'm not sure on why we can't use the no protest agreement, which I just signed on Brookwood Lane, for every situation just like that. And so to bring you up to standard there, if you buy a property in the new Prairie Lane, Pheasant Ridge number 3, you're going to have the internal streets as well as the external street. You're signing a non-consent to protest that will travel with that. Mm-hmm. That doesn't require me. I didn't have to put up $200,000 to build Brookwood. I just basically signed off on the developer, notify all the people who are moving in, saying, look, not only do you have Prairie Lane specials, but you also have the construction of Brookwood specials at some point. And that may sound like a lot, but if you can spread that over all of Veneer's land and all of my land and the land on the other side and do a percentage of that, each house may get assessed $700 to $800, $1,000 per lot.
Mm-hmm. Well, but that scenario that, and I appreciate you coming up and speaking to it, but that scenario that you just laid out for Commissioner Hardy was based on willing participants in the benefit district. I mean, you can go 10 to 25 years or whatever, but if you got someone that doesn't want to join the benefit district, it doesn't matter what the time period is.
Well, I think it takes 51% to make a benefit district, correct? I mean, that's all it would entitle.
Yeah, the issue with the benefit district is if you have a situation in which you have enough, I think that's correct, 51. If you have the right percentage there, you could create the district right then, and the other minority percentage, they can come in and make their case to you. But other than that, I mean, you get the discretion to decide that. So that's fine. The problem you're going to find is you're not always going to be able to form an active benefit district right at that time because you may not have the percentages. So then you're into the consent to specials or no protest approach. And in that case, there's not a hard and fast, Greg and I were just talking about that, and there's various legal interpretations, and bond counsel ultimately, if you're going to issue bonds, is going to be the one that you're going to take. And so ultimately it has to do with time is a factor, and there's not a hard and fast case that says, well, it's limited to 12 years or 15 years or whatever that might be. But the further out that is, if eventually in the future you have a legal protest against that consent act that was taken, let's say 18 years ago, you have a decent potential at some point in time of a court saying, this is out of date, it's not applicable anymore, and we're stuck with it at that point in time. So unfortunately, there isn't great guidance on how many years. It doesn't mean you can't use that tool, though. There could be situations, if we're talking about if you go with an interim standard and you're thinking about a future city standard, you could put the consent on, and it's always a tool that we could try to use later on the assumption that if we can't, that's fine. We already have a certain amount of the cost paid for, and you may have other cost recovery mechanisms in place too, but it's always a tool you might be able to use. So each one's going to be a little bit different depending on the circumstance as to what tools you want to try to apply. It's just there's not a perfect tool for everything.
Which I think goes to the flexibility the necessity for flexibility.
Yeah,
on this,
and
because it really is. I mean, we're just talking. I mean, if you just look at Holmes Road, there are so many different scenarios on Holmes Road, all by itself, between county side and city side, and the possible. You know, not a whole lot of homeowners or property parcel owners, but in some stretches there are, and so I think you're just looking at a really need for that flexibility that comes on. So I would opt for a more flexible approach, but and I think the 80-20 you were getting at was kind of more geared towards the interior type special assessments, just as a correction.
That's correct.
Okay.
it is, but the affordability inside has a lot of impact to the affordability of off-site improvements. That's the linkage. And so we've been spending a lot of time talking about the second reading. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this is an approach that spun out of the Planning Commission recommendation and so forth. And I think Todd did a good job of illustrating the, maybe the financial frustration of not knowing if they could even use this and what it means if it's approved. And it goes back to my earlier comment, which is if you believe that, others might have something to say as well, but if you believe that this approach, no matter how deep we get in the weeds and try to tweak it, is simply not a usable approach, we don't have enough hours in the rest of the evening to figure out the alternative approach. But what I can say is that that's why you have the opportunity to postpone, and we can get you the date to postpone, and we think the moratorium should match up with that. And then what we'll do is come back into a study session where we can get back into the weeds a little bit more on some alternative approaches and things that we talked about when I met with Todd and the rest of the group.
Just ask a general question. Would the policy as it's written now address the issue of Crawford Street east of Presbyterian Manor where there is no sidewalk? You know, if you put houses in there with kids who are going to want to get to the park, or they could take Brookwood to get to the school, but at some point that sidewalk has to, for safety's sake, come further east on Crawford.
My understanding is, and
go ahead.
speaking of, just remember when I was plating that, is that has gone by the wayside. And Mr. Stack can correct me, I believe when we were going through that, the only way to now get Crawford to extend from where it ends to Holmes Road with sidewalks and pavement is going to be through KDOT or somebody giving us a grant or the city at large paying for it. And I believe I remember that statement from back then. And that's why I'm getting back to when I pledged the 25 from the 10, it just made me upset. I'm like, well, how can everybody get off scot-free and not pay their portion? And it was because they were getting out at 10 years. And we just don't grow that fast. Right. And so that's why we were proposing 25.
Because I think that's the situation I would want to, if there was a similar situation in the future, where you don't put kids in an isolated development where there's no way for them to connect, either on bikes or on by foot.
Yeah, there's no doubt what you're talking about today needed to be talked about 20 years ago. It needed to be done 20 years ago. And I'm 100% on board saying that it needed to be done. I just don't know how we figure it now and trying to figure what they didn't do 20 years ago and then try and put something in place that shuts it all down immediately. Like and you got a big task ahead of you. I don't have the answer for it. I'd be happy to be at any study session and give you my input from that side, which I've been available to do. But I just don't want to adopt a policy that just we later go, that seemed weird. Wish I'd have known that.
Okay.
Yep. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Madam Mayor and fellow commissioners, my name is Bob Hayworth. I live at 913 Twin Oaks Drive. I'm owner of Lee Hayworth Construction and a developer in the community. And I've been a developer in the community now since the early 80s. So I've been a long time developer in the community. And I really think this needs to go back, to Jason and some type of committee cooperation with public developers, things like that. To look at all kinds of bases, not just what we're talking about today. I'm not going to repeat anything he said, at all. I do know that, I guess when you talked about developers being here, I know Bill Shepard and I were talking today and we heard about this meeting, and he's actually home sick today and texted me that he wasn't going to be able to make it here and he was sorry that he couldn't make it. But for there's lots of things. I mean, I've been to going up to the engineer's office and saying, you know, hey, I might want to get special assessments, want to do such and such for my streets. What do I do? Well, you've got to have your engineers get the whole plat, and until you get the engineers to do that whole plat, then the city commission is going to decide if they're going to allow to have specials. Well, that seems a little backwards. So that means I've got to spend $50,000 to $70,000 for an engineer to come and do the engineering work before I could go to the commission and find out, you know, how this thing's going to be financed. So there's lots of issues that developers looking at on trying to figure out costs and affordability. Salina is a very slow growth community. My dad started Bonnie Ridge in the 1960s. Right now, we're just a Schilling Road. That was in the 60s. You know, so Salina is a very slow growth community. Things do happen very slowly. With that in mind, I don't see any reason to rush into things and say, you know, man, we're going to put the mallet down and this is what we're going to do and this is what we're going to tell the developers they're going to have to do in the community. We're such a slow growth community. There's not people from all around Kansas wanting to come to Salina, Kansas to open up a bunch of streets and let's start selling and make some money, because it's not a big money maker. I guarantee you it is not. You know, so, and as Todd says, you know, you don't see money for a long time when you open up a development. It's not a big money maker. You know, it's something that is in our blood that we like to do, and it's something to where I believe in this community. I think this community is a great community to live in for families, whoever, and that's why I'm here. So, again, I'm not going to repeat anything he said, but I'd sure like things to be tabled or whatever you want to say it is. Any questions?
Thank you for answering the question I was getting ready to ask. I was going to say, well, gosh, if it's that hard, well, you guys do it, but particularly if you have to wait that long for a return. And I'm sure there's some internal motivation to keep it going. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay, what's the commission want to entertain a motion?
Commissioners, before you do that, I think Greg has some information for you with regards to, depending on what your motion might be, if you should postpone, he can work with you on the date that you'd postpone to, and also the impact of the moratorium if you want to hold those two items together. The point of that would be, is if you do that, we'll go into a study session, we'll go back in and talk about, again, all the get into the weeds of all the potential options that you might otherwise consider. It would be different from this, considerably different from this. That's, again, if you feel that that's what you want to do.
And a length of time for postponement, 60 days, or what's a reasonable time to?
We were looking roughly at that, playing the calendar a little bit, yeah.
Yes, if you wanted to consider that and thinking in a general time frame of 60 days, you could certainly extend. In looking at August, there is a planning commission meeting August 2nd, and I'm not suggesting that there wouldn't be the potential for certainly meeting sooner than that. I was just looking in terms of trying to anticipate the full process to come in for a landing, so to speak. If you're tying it to planning commission meetings, there is a planning commission meeting on Tuesday, August 2nd. The 60 days would come in with your meeting to follow on the 8th. And if you wanted to give a little room in case there was a need for a special meeting that same week or something, you know, one thought was potentially to go to the 12th. That would be, in effect, about 64 days, but it gives you a little more time that week rather than...
So you're saying a 54-day postponement?
Well, that would be certainly one way to address.
I'll trust your math and
it. The thought, if it, again, that was geared more toward close to 60, but still making sure you had a chance to meet following that August 2nd Planning Commission meeting, and still had some latitude during that week of the 8th. Your meeting would be on the 8th. And if you go to the week of the 8th, I think we had thought that possibly you might want to allow yourself till the 12th. In terms of, well,
The 12th is a Friday.
and I'm sorry, I was speaking more in terms of, you would probably want to extend the moratorium as one action, and then address when you might wish to reset, if you wanted to set or postpone second reading on the actual ordinance until one of your regular meeting dates, such as the 8th, that would certainly be one way to address it as well. If you wanted to leave open the opportunity for resolving the matter fully sooner, then you might want to give yourself an extension of the moratorium through the time period that I described, but you could set the second reading at any of your meetings in the interim if you wanted to keep that on a shorter pace, or you don't have to postpone consideration on second reading until the end of the extended moratorium by any means.
Commissioners, the reason we'd focus somewhat on 60 days is because if we start to get away from this version and start talking about through a study session various other approaches, which is fine, at some point we should run that back through and get the planning commissioner's input as well, because that's where we started with this. So we'd probably vary enough off of that we probably need to get their input in respect to their role. And if we do that, we felt that going back to them eventually and then back to you for final action, and then and what we may get into would probably affect not only this, but potentially your special assessment resolution as well. So you'd have at least a couple, but multiple actions eventually, depending on where you ended up. So then those have to be, once you go through planning commission, once we figure out conceptually what you're comfortable with, go back to planning commission, come back to you, have time in between to draw it all up. It takes some time, so we felt 60 days was probably more realistic than 30 days. Otherwise, we were focusing on 30 days. But I think Greg's thought is good that you could postpone this to the date certain on Monday. What would that be, Greg? August 8th, is that correct? So if you postpone this to Monday, August 8th, and then if you get past that, then you would want to add on your agenda, I believe they need to add on their agenda the consideration of the moratorium. Is that correct?
Today, you mean?
Yeah.
Yes, that would
So
be.
you'd need to vote to add that to your agenda, and then Greg has an action. If you do wish to extend that, he can give you that action to extend that to whatever date you want. But again, you put it on that Friday of that same week versus on the Monday. It gives a little bit of wiggle time if you need it.
So possibly postpone consideration on the second reading until August 8th, and then as a second matter, we're going to postpone.
Yeah, and those can be
continue the
separate motions.
moratorium.
Yeah, so you could do this
until-
one first, if that's a consensus of the governing body, then we can take you into the moratorium timing.
Well, I'd like to try and see if that would fly, Madam Chairman, and so if you'd allow me to make the motion to postpone consideration of the second reading of this item until August 8th, so that staff will have the opportunity to work with the development community, I would make that motion.
Second.
Okay, the motion has been made and seconded that we postpone the second reading of ordinance number 16-10835. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Motion carried, 5-0.
And then I would also move, Madam Chairman, that we extend the moratorium on the Planning Commission consideration of plats with frontage on unpaved roads for.
Add it to the agenda.
Well,
Or just add that.
Yeah, if this initial action would just be to add that, we anticipated that you might wish to go there, so we do have, it would need to be by ordinance, but we have one that I think we can get to you and see what you think of, if you wish to add it to your agenda.
So, Greg, would the motion be a motion to consider extension of the existing moratorium?
Correct.
To be added to the agenda for today, for discussion today?
When does the existing moratorium expire?
Tonight.
Is it
It
today?
actually, well, it was, it actually expires on the 8th.
Oh, okay.
This, it was effective on publication. So it expires, it'll be Wednesday.
Was it a 60-day moratorium and
It
the
was-
final publication? Is that kind of what you're saying?
It was 90 days from the effective date of the ordinance.
Okay.
The effective date was trying to make sure I believe it was the 10th. Yeah, it was published on the 10th of the month. And we have a couple of 31-day months in that 90-day period, so that's how it ended up being technically on the 8th of this month. So we're in a position to extend. And in this draft, if you decide you wish to go there, I'd spoken in terms of a specific date rather than just a number of days so that there wasn't any calculation having to be made.
So the motion would be to add to the agenda tonight, consideration of the moratorium.
Right.
Second.
Okay, and do we need the specific date or not?
Well, no, it'd just be right now a matter of whether you wish to add it to your
okay,
agenda, and then we have a draft for you to take a look at if you wish to go there.
Okay, I have a motion and a second to extend the
To add to
the agenda
this evening.
the moratorium, right? I have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed? Same sign. Okay. Motion carried.
We'll have a new agenda item.
We have to, something else here.
Commissioners, Mike's making copies. We thought we had copies of the moratorium ordinance extension. We don't. Won't take very long. You can either wait a couple of minutes or take a 5-minute recess, use the bathroom, whatever, and then come back and finish up.
That'll work.
That'll work.
5-minute recess.
How long's our executive session going to be? You can go right there and come back. The room would hate us, wouldn't they?
Are we in recess?
Yeah, they're going to make some copies of the moratorium,
Okay.
but don't go too far.
I mean, 5 minutes?
5 minutes.
Okay.
You can just declare a recess, right?
I'm sorry?
We don't have to vote on a recess.
We don't have to, yeah, we can just declare a recess.
This will be easy.
Is there any other motions? Any other business?
The
We need to do something.
Yes, if I may, Mayor, that's a draft of an ordinance that would, if it is your wish, to extend the moratorium. It acknowledges the fact that the 90 days moratorium was put in place, the work that has been done, but that the public interest warrants further review and consideration of the matter. The proposed extension in this draft extends through Friday, August 12th, 2016. And frankly, as I was thinking about this during the break, the only other consideration that came to my mind, it sounds as though the approach ultimately taken may very well be sufficiently different that I would want to recommend the opportunity for 2 more readings rather than just saying that it's a second reading on. It just sounds as though, I don't know, obviously, but in terms of addressing the potential that could be substantially different, I'm wondering if it makes sense to extend through August 15 so that you would have a first and second reading opportunity on the 8th, as you have already extended it to, and then have a second reading consideration on the 15th. Mr. Gage, what came to mind was the fact that depending on how this comes out, it could be sufficiently different that we would want to have 2 full readings. So if we just go that additional time from the 12th to the 15th, it would allow for a new first reading, if you will, following the Planning Commission meeting, and then a second reading in the normal course on the 15th. It would keep us from being in that being compelled to be compelled.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Is there a need to have that prior one second reading extended then, or do you want to just, is it good, okay to keep that open? Or would we have 2 actions at the same time taking place?
Well, I think with your having continued that second reading to the 8th, based on the current ordinance, I mean, it's theoretically possible that it would not be so substantially different as to require
Okay.
a
So it
Two more
allows
readings.
that, by keeping that, there's nothing wrong with if one should come up to,
Yeah, if it is substantially different, you'll have that ordinance before you, and I would indicate at that point in time, if you concurred, that it was sufficiently different that we needed to go through 2 readings rather than just 1. So I think we're postured to do that.
okay.
So here now, the motion would be to extend the moratorium until the 8th.
We'll just pass the ordinance.
8th, right?
Well, actually, we've got you set up for the ordinance to come back before you on the 8th. The draft refers to the moratorium being extended till the 12th, but I'm going to suggest that that actually be the 15th, so you have the opportunity to have your second reading, should that be necessary, on the 15th. Because it may very well be that we'll need another first and second reading, depending on how different the ultimate ordinance may or may not be. So my recommendation would be that where that draft now refers to through Friday, August 12th, it instead say through Monday, August 15th.
So moved.
We need a motion on that, then?
Extend the moratorium.
Okay.
Through Friday, or through, I'm sorry, Monday, August 15th, 2016.
Is there a
Yes,
second?
You're actually approving ordinance 16-10837 on first reading in order to
Right.
accomplish that. The extension of the moratorium needs to be by ordinance as well.
I move that we approve ordinance number 16-10837 as amended on first reading.
Second.
Okay, I have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. 5-0. 5-0.
Do we,
Passed.
can we, I'd like to make a motion that a compelling interest is present to have a second reading on the same day, if that's a proper motion.
On the same day as,
I was just about to
That's the
suggest
first
that.
reading.
I appreciate that. I think,
Yeah,
given
second.
the timing of the expiration of the current moratorium, it would be best to have second reading on this today as well.
Second.
have a motion and a second, compelling interest on second reading. Clerk call roll, please.
That's a simple motion.
Huh?
That's just a
Yeah,
simple
the
motion.
simple
the motion is simply
Oh.
to whether you advance to a second reading, so it's
Oh.
just a majority
I'm
vote.
legitimately confused.
Well, no, you're doing fine. It's,
Okay, I have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Madam Mayor, I move that we adopt on second reading ordinance number 16-10837, continuing the moratorium on Planning Commission consideration of plats and subdivisions to August 15, 2016.
Second.
I have a motion and a second to continue ordinance number 16-10837 to August 15th. All those in favor say aye.
Need the roll call.
Reading.
Huh?
This is
Oh,
the
I'm
second
sorry,
reading.
roll call. This is wrong.
Mayor Crawford,
Aye.
Commissioner Davis,
Aye.
Commissioner Hardy,
Aye.
Commissioner Ryan, Commissioner Blanchard.
Aye.
Okay. Is there any other business prior to motion for executive session? Any other business? Festival is next week. If you don't have your buttons, you're too late.
No, you can
Get 'em
buy your
till
buttons
Monday.
through midnight tonight.
First,
Oh, I thought it was midnight, noon.
Madam
Midnight
Mayor, I
tonight.
have just one little
Oh,
piece
he has
of
other
other
business.
business.
Okay.
And that is first of all, I'd like to thank the mayor for attending the North Salina 6th Annual Hog
Oh,
Roast.
I think I go about every
Appreciate
year.
that. And also, I'd just like to recognize, I mean, there's small things that happen all the time, and one small thing happened. I hope I don't embarrass her, but I'm going to bring it up. Had a person that was in a little bit of distress approach me at the hog roast about needing a place to stay and having different issues and just really needed some help. And thankfully, I knew just the right person to ask to take care of it, and that person was Sandra Beverly, who happened to be at the hog roast working the table for community relations and helping out with apartments and leasing and renters' rights and those types of things. So, but Sandra, being who she is and knowing everything, was able to help out, at least get the ball rolling on and helping this person find some safe and adequate temporary housing. And I think it just really shows the level of caring that happens when people are at certain things for certain reasons, and they have no idea that they're going to be called upon for providing those services, and just having the competency and the compassion that she has. She was able to do that. So just wanted to appreciate her and all the other folks that were at the hog roast.
It was just a
weekend.
great hog roast, and if you don't, and I got on the phone and invited several people. I didn't know if I should do that, but I did. Anyway, I really enjoyed it.
It was fun.
Really enjoyed it.
Just one little correct. The festival is this week, not next week.
Well,
weekend.
The end of this week.
Yeah, okay.
Right.
Just so folks won't show up a week late. Then. Okay.
Well, they better know by now. They don't have a button.
Madam Mayor, I move to recess into executive session for a certain amount of minutes here. Suggestion?
Let's try 30.
For 30 minutes to discuss with legal counsel matters subject to the attorney-client privilege for the reason that public discussion of those matters would waive the privilege and adversely affect the city's interest in the matters, and reconvene at 7:10 p.m.
Second.
Second. To what? What did he second? Oh, he seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? All right, we're in executive session. It's getting too late for me.
Commissioners, for the benefit of the public, we do not expect to have any action following, so.
No action. Okay.